All right, we're back with just a final few thoughts about this whole budget process. And this is kind of extra few things you should know about when it comes to this national budgeting process. So first off, when these subcommittees, especially on the Appropriations Committee, sometimes they can't have very specific language about how they want money to be spent. They're just giving X amount of money to X agency, and that theoretically that agency can spend that money in a lot of different ways. But Congress really wants them to spend it in a certain way, but they either don't have the language to put into the budget, or there's not the votes there if they did put that language in the budget. So what they can do is kind of enter it into the congressional record that they really want this money spent either definitely in this way, or we really don't want it spent like that. And that congressional record, it doesn't have the force of law. So those agencies that get that money aren't forced to follow what Congress is saying they should or shouldn't do with that money. But agencies kind of quickly figured out that if they don't do what Congress wants them to do with that money, that is going to impact the amount of money they get next year and the year after that and the year after that. So even though these kind of suggestions don't have the force of law, once they're entered into the congressional record, most agencies, most of the time, will follow that suggestion just because they want those Congress members kind of on their side, and they want that to keep that person, that Congress member, in their good graces, so that they'll get good budgets in succeeding years. Another thing we got to talk about is backdoor spending. So the budget covers the vast majority of government spending, but not all of it. There are other ways that Congress can kind of increase or decrease money to certain agencies or certain programs, even outside of the budget process. So, for instance, the budget's already been passed, but we're now going to pass this new program, and we're going to authorize that program to borrow money from the Treasury in order to pay for it. Or we're going to authorize them to use money from somewhere else in order to pay for it. So that's increasing spending that doesn't actually go through that budgetary process, at least in that first year. For the second year, it might have to go through the budget process. But there are kind of little tricks Congress can play to allow programs or new groups or new agencies that they've created to get the money they need, even outside of this huge budget process, right? And this is one of the reasons, although not the main reason, why there's a big difference between authorizations and outlays. So authorizations is, year by year, we are authorizing this agency to spend this amount of money on this program. But that might be not just for this year. That might be over the next 10 years, we're authorizing this agency to spend $10 billion on this program, but over 10 years, right? So these authorizations are spending money kind of year by year by year, but outlays, i.e. the money we actually spend, is going to be a combination of the authorizations made for this year plus the authorizations made in prior years, but not counting the authorizations made this year or in prior years for future years, right? So an example here might be NASA, right? NASA programs usually take a long time to kind of actually get launched into space, right? So maybe we want a new Jupiter orbiter, right? And so Congress says, all right, NASA, you're allowed to spend $2 billion over the next 5 years to create this Jupiter orbiter. So that would be an authorization of $2 billion for this year, but it's going to be only a fraction of that is actually going to be an outlay for this year, and then a small outlay next year, and a small outlay next year, and a small outlay the next year, right? So each year we authorize a certain amount of money, but that could be vastly either over or under what we actually spend, because again, we have to look at previous year's authorizations, when we're looking at how much money we're actually spending this year. And so the budget process kind of has to take into account both of those, because we can kind of commit money for future years, and prior Congresses have committed money that we have to now spend this year, right? Another aspect that this whole process runs into is a lot of times, if an agency or program or group doesn't spend money that they were budgeted for this fiscal year, that money kind of has to get returned. They don't get to keep it, right? So what happens then is that in September, a lot of agencies will say, oh, we still have $100 million for this agency that we didn't use, that we were budgeted, we were given, and we haven't used it yet. So it's just sitting in our bank account, and if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. So in September, a lot of times, right before the new fiscal year starts, they'll say, "Oh, we need to spend this $100 million or however much money we have left over from the budget," and they kind of go on. They choose to spend that in various and sundry ways. In academia, there's kind of a similar thing where before the new school year budget starts, my boss will often send me emails saying, "Hey, we've got this extra money left over in the budget. Do you need this new software program, or do you need a travel stipend, or do you need this, do you need that? Because we have this extra money, and if we don't use it, we're going to lose it," right? Another thing we can do is what's called reprogramming money, right? So let's go back to NASA. I'm a big space geek, so I use NASA a lot in discussions of this kind of thing. Let's say, NASA's got 20 different programs going on, and money in the budget for each one, and they realize, oh, this program we really want to do, we want to send a new Mars rover, but it's over budget, and we don't have the money in the budget for that program to pay for it, but we really want this new Mars rover. What can we do? Well, we have the authority and the ability to say, okay, this other program that Congress gave us money for, but it's not nearly as high on our priority list. We're going to cancel that program and send all its money to this Mars rover that we do really want, right? So there's some latitude given to different agencies and organizations and programs to kind of say, hey, we have this money in the budget for this thing and this money in the budget for this thing, but we can't afford, with the budgets we were given, we can't afford both. So we're going to take some money from this program and give it to that other program, which is bad for the one, but it means the other one gets fully funded and at the level is actually needed, not just the level it was budgeted. So the agencies have the ability to kind of shift money around like that, some more than others. And then the other thing we got to talk about is impoundment. And impoundment is where some higher up says, sometimes the president, sometimes an agency director says, hey, I'm not going to give you this money. It was budgeted by Congress. We're supposed to spend it like this. We're supposed to give it to this program or whatever. But for some reason, I don't like that program, or I think it's a bad idea, or there's some other reason where I'm just not going to give that program this money. I'm going to sit on it. I'm going to hold on to it. So even though Congress authorized it, that program or that group or that agency is just not getting their money. And then that kind of starts a big legal battle. Do they have to give it? Should they give it? It becomes a political situation where the voters get to kind of decide. And it can get very complicated when a president or an agency head or whoever decides to do that kind of thing. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the reconciliation process. And the reconciliation process is very, very, very inside baseball. It's very kind of a niche thing. But this is a process by which, this is way simplified. But essentially, for a limited number of topics, usually required to be some kind of taxation or spending bill, once a year, the United States Congress can kind of, through this reconciliation process, create a new law, a new policy that does changes taxes, changes spending. And importantly here, this bill is not subject to the filibuster in the Senate. So this hasn't been used often, but when it is used, usually the situation is you've got a House, a Senate, and a president all controlled by one political party, but they can't get this new program or this new thing that they want to pass into, they can't pass it because the Senate, the minority party in the Senate will filibuster it, and thus it can't pass the Senate, and thus it can't become law. So they will use this reconciliation process, which again has very limited kinds of laws that can be passed through this process, and it can only happen once a year. But they'll use this process to get it to pass the House, pass the Senate, because the minority party can't filibuster it, and then signed into law by the president. It's not a common thing. It's not an easy thing. And again, it's very limited in the kinds of things that can be passed this way. But it is sometimes an option. It was used famously a year or two ago as I record this. But that is something that you watching this should be aware of. All right. Finally, we have reached the end of Section 5, all about budgets. If you're still watching, please know I really appreciate you guys watching these. I really appreciate you taking the time and effort to sit here and listen to me drone on and on. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one.